My plan is to hide, to avoid, but if I get busted, if I get captured, I'm not going to do a Rambo, I'm going to do a Gandhi. If I get captured, I'm not going to do a Rambo, I'm going to do a Gandhi. If I get captured, I'm not going to do a Rambo, I'm going to do a Gandhi.
All right, everyone, it's Monday, August the 28th, the year 2017. Did that sound like the words of a man who is creating a federal hit list and conspiring and soliciting his friends to murder federal agents? You need to think about that question, because that's what he's been charged with and he's been falsely convicted of. And these Scrocky withheld exculpatory evidence and allowed false testimony to make that happen. You know, this issue of the federal hit list has come up since Scrocky made it an issue during oral arguments 12 days ago. It came up as a question on the Gideon's Army call, and I wrote Schaeffer a letter, and I want to deal with this question. What about the federal hit list? Was Schaeffer creating a list of people to murder, right? Of people in the federal government to murder? That is absurd. Even though Scrocky, I don't know how he goes to sleep at night. I don't know how he manages to get up in front of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and promote this garbage. But he does. So we've got to refute it. I'm going to play some of this oral argument so you can hear Scrocky, and then I might stop it, I don't know, and I'm going to play Mr. Filipovic, and you'll hear both sides, and then I'm going to read a letter from Schaeffer Cox that deals with this issue because it arrived in the mail today. It took 12 days to get here. Let me also say this. It's no coincidence that they killed Schaeffer's email communication with me and everybody else just before oral arguments, because he gave another inmate a 12-cent Bic pen. Supposedly there's a prison policy that you cannot give another inmate anything of value, even though there is a pen at every computer in the law library. There are pens available, and yet Schaeffer decides to give a pen to another inmate, and they take his Corelink's email away for 90 days. We'll be lucky if we're able to communicate with him via Corelink's before Christmas. So now I have to write him a letter, and he takes several weeks, and it finally comes back. Or it may take a week or a week and a half, may take 2 weeks. But I got the letter. We understand in further detail about this federal hit list, but let's listen to Scrocky talk about it before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals.
I want to talk about the sufficiency of the evidence that Mr. Filipovic mentioned. And I want to point to really two exhibits which are really crystallize this entire case. And again, urge the court to, in the briefing, appellant asked the court really to focus on the beginning and the aspects of what happened in the beginning of this case. The court needs to look at the whole thing all the way up to the end, because the important part is this is what Mr. Cox really wanted. This is the hit list, as we call it, that Mike Anderson drew. And it's Exhibit 504 from the trial, SER 7, page 50.
Did you hear that phrase, the hit list that Mike Anderson drew? What's Mike Anderson got to do with Schaeffer Cox? Who cares what Mike Anderson does in his spare time?
1979. Mr. Cox, and this is where, I'm sorry?
SDR what?
Number 7 at page 1571, Your Honor. So SER 7, page 1571.
Thank you.
This happened in the fall of 2009. And there's things in the briefing that state that it just had state people on it, but there are federal people here. And there's also a map of the Fairbanks Federal Office. And Mr. Cox talked to Mr. Anderson. He testified, the jury heard all this. I need the names of federal marshals. I want some paperwork from the Vernons. And he lists 3 federal employees on this piece of paper. And why is this important? It's important because later on, Mr. Anderson testified, I added one more name to the list, and that was Marshal Jimmy Johnson.
Mr. Anderson testified. I added one more name on the list. Let me just offer for your consideration, how many lists does the government have on us? The government has a no-fly list, a domestic terrorist list. How many lists do you think you and I are on? They listen to every single phone call we ever make. They know where we travel. They have a history of all of our emails and the places that we visit on the web. How many lists does the government have? And just because you make a list, even if he did make a list, it wouldn't mean a hill of beans anyway. It doesn't mean he's conspiring to kill people on the list. And I happen to know that one of the people on the list was Trina Bootcamp, which Schaeffer loved Trina Bootcamp. There is anybody who understands the story and realizes what happened with the testimony of Trina Bootcamp, knows the relationship between Schaeffer and Trina Bootcamp, knows that there is no way on God's green earth that Schaeffer was conspiring to kill Trina Bootcamp. Trina Bootcamp did work for TSA. Okay, Schaeffer was having conversations with her about her role with the TSA, but Schaeffer wasn't conspiring to kill her. Guaranteed. Guaranteed Schaeffer wasn't conspiring to kill anybody.
Right here. And the important thing about that is it says federal hit list. It doesn't say come to coffee list or I want to talk to these people. It says federal hit list. A hit list means something. This is at ER 620.
Yeah, that's a title that Mike Anderson gave it. Okay, Mike Anderson's not in prison. Schaeffer Cox is the one in prison that's spending 26 years in prison. So how would you like to spend 26 years in prison because your friend calls something federal hit list? Who knows why he did it, but Schaeffer didn't do it. Schaeffer didn't title it federal hit list. And who knows why Mike Anderson named it that. But I guarantee you, Schaeffer Cox was not conspiring with Mike Anderson to murder anybody on that list.
It's Exhibit 506 from the trial. And you have to, when looking at this issue, you have to also fold into Mr. Cox's own statements and what was found on his phone.
Mr. Cox's own statements are, I would rather pull a Gandhi, not a Rambo.
They found the phrase hit list on his phone. He testified hit list meant a music list. I was going to make a music list.
They found the phrase hit list on his phone. I want you guys, how many guys that are listening to this have a 1 terabyte hard drive? How many people even know what a 1 terabyte hard drive is? Or a 500 gigabyte or 2 terabyte? They didn't just search his phone. They searched all of Schaeffer's electronic devices. I want you to think about if somebody came into your house and confiscated every single electronic device you have, whether it be your phone, whether it be your computers, whether it be any digital hard drives that you have spare in the closet, any external USB thumb keys, and they're gonna search, they're gonna perform a word search on every electronic device you have in your entire house. Do you think it's possible after they go through terabytes and terabytes of data that they're going to find the words hit list? It's possible they might. I guarantee you, if you search through terabytes of computer files in my house, you might find that phrase. That doesn't mean that I'm conspiring to murder anybody.
He testified he wasn't interested in grenades. He completely contradicted everything that was recorded by the government in the undercover recordings on the day he was arrested.
Yeah, he testified he wasn't interested in grenades. You know why? Because he wasn't interested in grenades. He never owned any live grenades. He never practiced with any live grenades. And the only reason he was even talking about grenades is because Gerald J.R. Olson shoved some in his face during the takedown.
I would respectfully suggest, and as we've argued in our reply brief, the government is overstating and misstating the evidence in several key respects. Just now, with respect to Mr. Cox wanting the list, wanting that list towards the end, it was Mr. Olson at the direction of the FBI that was wanting the list and went to Mr. Cox. And FBI, of course, wanted this list because they were concerned. It didn't come from Mr. Cox. That came from Mr. Olson from the FBI.
All right. We've heard the lawyer speak. How about we actually listen to what Schaeffer has to say? How about we just put aside what the lawyer's got to say about all this and we listen to Schaeffer Cox? I think that's a good idea because I ain't never met a lawyer I trusted in my whole life. Schaeffer Cox, August 23rd, the year 2017. Dear Rudy, In the music folder of my iPhone, there was a tab for hit list, but the tab was empty. What they did was keyword search all, not just the phone, but they did a keyword search on all our digital everything. And that's the only thing that came back. Pretty silly, right? This is another letter that I asked him to deal with this hit list. Here's what he wrote. Dear Rudy, you asked about the supposed hit list and people to murder. There was no hit list. There never was one. There wasn't going to be one. Anderson simply said he knew how to look up anyone's address online, and that's what he testified to. The hit list only existed as a concept in the FBI's mind. They told J.R. Olson, their spy, $300,000 whore who ran drugs for Hell's Angels, lifelong criminal, who was motivated to be an informant for the FBI because he was facing a lifelong sentence of his own. They told J.R. Olson, $300,000 whore, their spy, over and over to try to get a hit list. He's the one that showed up and obsessed on getting some kind of list. He didn't even call it a hit list. He just called it a list. But there was no list to give him, and there was no interest by anyone other than J.R. Olson in making a list. All it ever was J.R. Olson fishing, but nobody would bite. That's a fact. Then the forked-tongued liar Scrocky just referred to the hit list over and over until people wrongly assumed it must be a real thing. It's not real. The hit list is an imaginary prop in Scrocky's self-aggrandizing fantasy world where he's the dashing lawyer saving Gotham City from a super-villain who has a hit list of helpless townspeople. But that's all it is. It's featured in the fairy tale Scrocky dreamed up to pleasure his self-infatuated ego. But it doesn't exist in real life. It's actually not uncommon for bureaucrats like Scrocky to lose touch with reality as they fall deeper and deeper into their self-centered fantasy. We see celebrities do it all the time. Nerds do it with their Dungeons and Dragons fantasy games. I literally had a pudgy dork introduce himself to me and tell me he was the elf wizard of Nordok or some crap. I laughed, which offended him, so he pulled out his tablet and showed me. Sure enough, I just shook hands with the elf wizard of Nordok. But in reality, it was just Carl, an unemployed Cheeto eater who's in love with his own avatar, a 6-foot tall elf wizard with quadruple D breast and a 23-inch waist. Carl spun a fairy tale where he could cast himself as the hero. Scrocky did the same thing, and they are both pathetic losers when it comes to real life. Put that in your real life pipe and smoke it. Schaeffer Cox.